How did we come to believe that our only value is in what we can produce? Many of us who grew up in the church were taught that our worth and maybe even our salvation depends on how much we do. More hours, more service, more hustle.
We gotta do more, gotta be more!
But is that really what God asks of us? When did just being human stop being enough for God? Well, let's talk about it. I'm Joshua, a Jesus follower and truth seeker. Welcome back to The Truth in Tension. I think at its root, this idea of some kind of productivity gospel, this prove yourself Christianity, can be traced down to a single problem, a single issue that lies at its heart and speaks to a heart of fear that we as humans naturally have, namely the fear of not being enough. From childhood, we all pick up on this message that we're only as valuable as what we can contribute to our families, our jobs, our communities. We fear that if we stop producing, we stop mattering, that maybe we'll be forgotten, replaced, or unloved. It's honestly a fear as old as our recorded history. Even just within the biblical story, the children of Israel had just come out of Egypt, where their entire worth as slaves was measured by how many bricks they could make. And it's the same fear that works its way through our modern culture and into our modern churches. And many of us who grew up in the church had that fear reinforced by sermons, programs, by expectations of the church as a whole. It wasn't always intentional, and it was often done with the best intentions at heart. But I think a lot of us felt the same thing, that our faith felt like a performance review. The message was subtle, but it was consistent, and it was relentless. If you're not doing more, you're not faithful enough. Maybe not even saved. Then this double bind, the human fear of being worthless plus the church's hustle culture drives us to constant exhaustion, spiritual anxiety, and guilt. We push ourselves to insane levels of exhaustion, and then we still feel guilty as though we're not doing enough. So if God really loves all of his children, and Jesus says that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, why does church sometimes feel like Egypt, where our value is measured in bricks? Well, as with many things, we've tried to solve it. Unfortunately, our methods tend to repeat themselves. We create a problem, and then we try to solve it with the same method that was used to create it. And to understand this attempt at fixing it, we're going to take a brief second to kind of talk about its history. What we now call the church hustle culture, or what I'm calling the productivity gospel, can be traced back to something called the Puritan work ethic. So let's just briefly discuss that and how we got here. So the Puritan work ethic is actually a lot older than I thought it was when I first started researching for this video. But it grew out of this unique mix of theology and economics. The theological aspects of that began in the Protestant Reformation back in the 16th century, with reformers like Martin Luther and others talking about a calling. This is how they described work, not just as a job, not just as something to complete or to fulfill a contract for pay, but as a calling, or Beruf. I hope that's how you pronounce it. I don't speak German. And there is something deeply true about this idea of work as a calling, that everyday work can be holy, not just ministry. That in carrying out our daily tasks, we can find some connection to God. And then it did get, in some sects, sort of entangled with the ideas of salvation and how one is saved. Namely, this happened in more Calvinist circles, where the idea was that you didn't really know who was elect, who was predestined, what have you. And if God really chose who would be saved, and you couldn't know for sure if you were one of them, then one of the only ways to separate those who are saved and those who aren't, and one of the only ways to find assurance, was the fruit that people bore. So for many, the answer to how do I know I'm saved became, what do I do? What are the works that I produce? And so gradually we began to have this idea that hard work, frugality, and financial success based on those things are a sign of God's favor. Now, with this theological basis, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, this Puritan work ethic fit perfectly with the newly emerging capitalism in England and the American colonies. These colonists needed a justification for expansion, industry, and profit making. And the Puritan work ethic kind of gave it that holy stamp of approval. Sabbath laws and anti-idleness codes turned rest into regulated act, and were often more about social control than spiritual restoration. So productivity wasn't just about survival anymore, and rest was no longer something that was mandated as a good thing. Work became a moral duty, and rest kind of fell by the wayside, because if you were resting, you weren't producing, meaning you were less holy. Through this, sermons began to equate industriousness with holiness and idleness with sin. We've all probably heard the phrase, idle hands are the devil's playground. And again, there is truth to this, but it's no longer this idea that you work and do something that you feel called to do and are rewarded with payment for that. It's you work and work and work because that's what you do. Because somehow that makes you holier or a better Christian. The churches emphasized ministry work and service as proof of maturity, sometimes to the neglect of rest and contemplation, which are the most foundational practices in Christianity to begin with. Even generosity was also kind of like wrapped in with this work ethic. The harder you worked, the more you could give to God, reinforcing the idea that your efforts earn favor with God. And this was echoed by the prosperity gospel, very much on the opposite ends of the political or spiritual spectrums, but very much teaching a similar thing when it comes to industriousness. And the newly emerging modern evangelical culture repeats this pattern. God blesses the hardest workers. If you're not thriving, you must not be trying hard enough, or worse, you might be out of God's will. And your worth is measured in fruits, but those fruits are defined by busyness and visible output, not by love, joy, peace, and rest. And that brings us to where we are now, in a church culture that is overworked, burned out, and ready for something new, ready for a radical rest, a sabbath like Jesus told us to observe when he walked the earth. Because this productivity gospel turns the Christian life into a never-ending performance review. It shifts your worth from who you are in Christ to what you can produce for him. It's Pharaoh's economy in church clothes. The same brick quotas, but with a cross stamped in the mold. And this productivity gospel has gone so far as to even take Bible stories and parables and things within Christianity that were meant for rest and make them something that promotes hustle. Just as one example, the parable of the talents. How many of us have heard that this parable is about how we need to steward well what God has for us and invest it to have greater dividends for the kingdom? That the master was a stand-in for God, and when he returned, the servant that did his bidding best was the servant who went and invested it. But in this parable, the master is not a stand-in for God. He represented Herod. And he was even called out by the servant whom he called wicked for being a man who reaps what he didn't sow, who profits where he didn't work. In Jesus' day, a talent was an enormous sum of money. To do what the first servant did, to double 10 talents, is only accessible through really shady means. Things like high-interest loaning, which was forbidden by Torah. The second servant, who did the same thing with 5 talents, was also doing things that were forbidden by Torah. The only one who did what was right as pertains to the Bible was the final servant. The final servant didn't partake in high-interest loaning or high-risk investment. He buried the gold in accordance with rabbinic tradition. So the so-called good servants in this passage double their wealth by engaging in practices that violate Torah, violate the principles of justice and mercy. And the wicked servant is the only one who refuses to participate in this exploitation, burying the money instead of using it to harm others. And he is punished by the master, once again, calling him out for being a man who profits where he didn't work, who reaps what he didn't sow. But by the kingdom, this wicked servant is the righteous one. This parable doesn't promote hustle culture. It doesn't show us that financial gain is somehow a proof of our relationship with God. In fact, it shows us quite the opposite. It shows us that the ones who demand that we make greater dividends and higher returns and continually hustle are likened to Herod. If you really want to see the parallels there with Herod, I encourage you to look up the life of Herod and read the account in Luke of Jesus' parable of the talents. This really kind of showcases exactly what was being said. The parallels are too strong to not be there. This was a Herod stand-in, not God. And it teaches that Jesus' economy is different, and that we may be punished for doing the right thing, for resting, for not engaging in the exploitative hustle of the world. Jesus in this parable is not praising hustle, but exposing the world's economy of extraction and praising resistance to it. The Puritan work ethic and modern evangelical hustle culture tells us to be the good servant in Pharaoh's or Herod's system, to produce and multiply wealth for the master. The gospel of Jesus calls us to be the wicked servant in that system, to step out of the grind and live by the rhythm of God's kingdom, where our identity in God defines our worth, and justice and rest define our actions. Well, if the problem is a fear of worthlessness, of not being enough, and the solutions we've tried over and over again through history are these productivity-based, prove yourself, measure value by how much you produce ways of doing things, the next logical thing to try is rest. If you're overworked, rest. Even if you're not overworked, rest. In creation, God didn't rest because he was tired, but because the work was complete and very good. Everything was put to rights. Humanity's first full day was that day of rest. A statement that our value is in being, not in doing. In Deuteronomy 5, Sabbath is directly tied to liberation from slavery in Egypt. God says, in essence, you are not Pharaoh's slaves anymore. You will not be defined by endless production, even making Sabbath the first day of the week, beginning with rest. And before we go trying to mandate things about resting and how to do it and when to do it, remember what Jesus said when he said that the Sabbath was not made for man, but man for the Sabbath. A declaration that our worth and rest are gifts. They're not rewards after having done enough work. They're not something that we should put endless laws and rules around. They're a time to recognize things as put to rights, even when they're not, by resting in the trust of God. A time to decide to put away our work, to postpone productivity, and recognize that it is not us who produces. Because our worth isn't earned. It is declared by the one who made you in his image. And the Sabbath that he commands is a resistance. It's saying no to the world's demand that you prove your value through output. It's not laziness, it's living in the reality that your value is fixed in God's love, not in your productivity. So as you go about today, this week, this month, remember that you are worthy because God says you are worthy, not because of what you produce. Consider ways to say no to the constant demand that's rooted in proving your worth through production. If the thought of rest makes you feel guilty, that's probably a sign you need it most. So rest. If you've been running on the treadmill of do more, be more, and you're exhausted, remember this. Your worth was never in your work. It's in the image of God that you bear. And that's where we're headed next. In this next video, we talk about what it means to be made in God's image. We'll unpack what that identity really is and why it changes everything about how you see yourself and others. I'll see you there. Till then, go in peace, walk in truth, follow always the law of love.